In today's video, we're diving into the legacy of one of the most controversial presidencies in American history. When Lyndon B. Johnson entered the White House after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, few could have predicted just how profoundly he would shape the nation. Fueled by a deep desire for power and an even deeper commitment to reform, Johnson launched a bold and domestic agenda that he called the Great Society. But did it work? And what legacy did it leave behind? That's what we're going to discuss today. Let's get started. Lyndon B. Johnson was not John F. Kennedy. Where Kennedy was cool and distant, Johnson was fiery and forceful. He had to be in the center of things, commanding attention, directing outcomes, and dominating every room he entered. He not only craved power, he also wanted to be loved by the American people. Domestic policy was his top priority. After Kennedy's tragic assassination in 1963, Johnson channeled the nation's grief into action.
Today, John Fitzgerald Kennedy lives on in the immortal words and works that he left behind. He lives on in the mind and memories of mankind. He lives on in the hearts of his countrymen. No words are sad enough to express our sense of loss. No words are strong enough to express our determination to continue the forward thrust of America that he began.
He pledged that Kennedy's stalled legislative agenda would finally be passed, and under Johnson's leadership, it was. Unlike Kennedy, Johnson loved the gritty political infighting and legislative maneuvering of Congress. The very gridlock that had paralyzed Kennedy's efforts broke open under Johnson's pressure. In just the first 6 months of 1965, he proposed 87 bills to Congress. 84 of them passed. Between 1963 and 1966, Johnson compiled the most impressive legislative record of any president since Franklin Roosevelt. He was aided by a wave of sympathy for Kennedy and the skillful use of his own considerable political talents. But Johnson didn't just push JFK's vision. He introduced his own sweeping reform plan, the Great Society. Johnson's first full year in office was dominated by the 1964 election, and there was little doubt that he would win. The Republican Party nominated Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona, a staunch conservative who opposed many federal programs and questioned Social Security. Johnson's moderate image and message of unity contrasted sharply with Goldwater's hardline conservatism, and the results were a landslide. Johnson won more than 61% of the popular vote, the largest share of the vote for any candidate in American history. Goldwater carried only Arizona and 5 Deep South states. Although Goldwater lost, his campaign lit the fuse of a new conservative movement that would rise in future decades. But in the short term, Johnson's sweeping victory gave Democrats overwhelming majorities in Congress. With a friendly Congress and a national mandate, Johnson set out to reshape America. Despite America's post-war prosperity, the 1950s and the early 1960s revealed deep cracks beneath the surface. White flight, as it's often called, to the suburbs left behind urban neighborhoods that fell into poverty, especially for minorities. Cities tore down old housing and built highways and business districts, often displacing the poor in the process. Critics like John Kenneth Galbraith in The Affluent Society and Michael Harrington in The Other America warned that poverty was still a national crisis. Harrington estimated that 1/3 of Americans still lived below the poverty line. Johnson took action. His war on poverty became the centerpiece of the Great Society. The most enduring legacies of Johnson's war on poverty were Medicare and Medicaid, two landmark health programs passed in the mid 1960s. Medicare, passed in 1965, provided federal health insurance to all Americans over 65, regardless of income. This avoided the stigma of welfare and gained widespread support, including from the middle class and the medical community. Doctors could continue private practice and charge their usual fees. Medicare simply paid the bill. A year later, Medicaid expanded coverage to include welfare recipients and low income individuals of all ages. These programs were decades in the making and marked the most ambitious expansion of social welfare since the New Deal. To coordinate the attack on poverty, Johnson created the Office of Economic Opportunity, or OEO. This agency launched programs focused on education, housing, healthcare, and job training. At the heart of it was an ambitious and controversial idea: community action. Community action meant involving local residents in planning and running the programs that served them. The idea was radical. It aimed to empower the poor directly and give them a voice in government. Some community action programs worked well. They created jobs and trained future leaders. But others ran into administrative problems, misuse of funds, or political backlash. Though the OEO spent nearly $3 billion in its first 2 years, it could not overcome its flaws. And as the Vietnam War escalated, funds for anti poverty programs began to shrink. The Great Society was more than just anti poverty. Johnson sought to rebuild America's cities, improve schools, and reform immigration. The Housing Act of 1961 provided nearly $5 billion in grants for parks, transit systems, and middle income housing. In 1966, Johnson created the Department of Housing and Urban Development and appointed Robert Weaver as its first secretary, the first Black American to serve in a cabinet position. He also launched the Model Cities program to fund pilot projects for urban redevelopment. Where Kennedy had failed to pass education aid, Johnson succeeded. The 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act offered federal support to both public and private schools, based on the income level of students rather than the needs of the school. This compromise satisfied critics and paved the way for broader education funding. Perhaps one of the most overlooked but transformative laws of the 1960s was the Immigration Act of 1965. It abolished the restrictive national origins quotas that had favored Northern Europeans for decades. Although it retained some restrictions on Latin American immigration, it opened the doors to immigrants from Asia, Africa, and Southern and Eastern Europe. By the 1970s, America's immigrant population began to shift dramatically, ushering in a more diverse, multicultural society. By the mid 1960s, liberalism, anchored in anti communism abroad and belief in government power at home, was at its height. Johnson's Great Society was the fullest expression of this ideology. Programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and civil rights legislation aimed to root out racial injustice, eliminate poverty, and ensure opportunity. Even Republican presidents like Eisenhower and Nixon accepted the basic premise of federal government involvement in social welfare. Yet the Great Society came with a cost. Federal spending surged. In 1961, the federal budget stood at $94.4 billion. Dollars. By 1970, it had more than doubled to $196.6 billion. Dollars. As the Vietnam War intensified, the Great Society's funding was squeezed and public support began to erode. Still, its achievements were real and lasting. Hunger declined. Healthcare reached millions of people who had gone without. In 1959, 21% of Americans lived below the poverty line. By 1969, that number had dropped to just 12%, the greatest reduction in poverty in American history. Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society was ambitious, very costly, and flawed, but it was also bold, compassionate, and enduring. He reshaped America's commitment to the poor, the elderly, the sick, and the disenfranchised, not with mere speeches, but with legislation. And while not all his programs succeeded, they redefined the role of government in American life. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time.